Introduction, 20th Century Design and Culture Revisited. Perhaps we should speak of a political economy of design. This book is an almost completely rewritten version of one I wrote back in the early 1980s, entitled An Introduction to Design and Culture in the 20th Century. Sitting down to rewrite it, I initially set out with the idea that I would simply add a new section to accommodate the events of the intervening years. Very swiftly, however, I realised that that was not going to be possible. Not only had many more things happened in the world of design since the 1980s, my perspective on the subject had also been utterly transformed by the vast amount of theoretical literature that had emerged since then. While the broad themes that directed the earlier text remained valid, something very substantial had happened in the intervening years, which meant that if the new text was going to constitute a valid contribution from the perspective of the earlier 20th century design, a much more radical overhaul was going to be needed. The essential story of design's passage through the 20th century had, of course, not changed substantially from the earlier account. However, the vast amount of new primary research and intellectual debate that had emerged between the mid-1980s and the present day under the umbrella heading of postmodernism, relating in particular to the general area of the culture of consumption, required the context of design to be approached quite differently. Back in 1986, I had written that, within the framework of industrial capitalism, which created it and continues to dominate it in contemporary society, design is characterized by a dual alliance with both mass production and mass consumption, and these two phenomena has determined nearly all its manifestations. Like Janus, design looks in two directions at the same time. As a silent quality of all mass-produced goods, it plays a generally unacknowledged but vital role in all our lives. As a named concept within the mass media, it is, however, much more visible and generally recognized. The same statement still holds true for this later study. The difference between them, then and now, however, is that while the 1986 text acknowledged design's important role within consumption, it paid little more than lip service to the ways in which designed artifacts and images negotiated the arenas of the social and the cultural through the mediation of consumption. This was not because it didn't deem it important, but rather because, at this time, there was little research available which would demonstrate the depth of the relationship, the extent to which, that is, the modern concept of design was born of market demand and facilitated by mass manufacturing industry. Designers and their institutional support structure in the public and private sectors. Material relating to these last three areas fill the majority of the pages of the last book, but little detail was presented with which to illuminate the first. As this book will demonstrate in some detail, however, design's relationship with production and the world of professional practice should not, as it is in so many studies emanating from the field of cultural studies, be ignored. Without it, none of the complex contradictions that are the very stuff of design can be adequately engaged with. Having said that, if the rapidly changing society that characterized the era of modernity had not required a visual and a material means of expressing its aspirations and its identities, design, and by implication designers, would not have played such a prominent role in modern life. Design and designers are, and have been for many years, a sine qua non of the modern commercial system, ensuring, through the activities of the production and consumption, that people's needs and desires, whether consciously acknowledged or not, are visual and material images and artifacts that enter the marketplace and help us define who we are. This simple idea provided the starting point for the new introductory study of the relationship between design and culture since 1900. The structure of the book divides the 20th century into two main periods, 1900 to 1938 and 1940 to the present. They correspond in broad terms to the historical periods of modernity and postmodernity, even though there is not a sudden transition from one to the other, but rather a considerable overlap. Each of the 10 chapters is divided into two sections to allow a broad chronology to guide the narrative. The first sections in the first 5 chapters of the book cover the years 1900 to 1914, while their second sections deal with the period 1915 to 1939. In the second part of the book, the first sections of the next 5 chapters cover the period 1940 to 1969, while the second sections of those chapters provide an account of design's trajectory over the period 1970 to the present day. Because design's role in the marketplace is deemed to be so fundamental to its acculturization, the first chapters of each of the two main parts of the book focus on the broad context of the cultural consumption. Much writing related to this subject has emerged since the 1980s, focusing on subjects and themes as diverse as department stores, shopping, the city, spectacle, gender, ethnicity, class, taste, and the influence of the mass media, not to mention the vast amount of theoretical work emanating from such diverse disciplines as history, including the history of religion, social history, cultural history, art history, decorative arts history, architectural history, design history, visual culture, social psychology, and cultural geography. The broad-based body of literature has positioned design, whether overtly or by implication, as a cultural phenomenon. At the same time, design's inherent multidisciplinarity is such that it has also been continuously dependent for its changing self-definition over the period in question, on its close links with the world of economics, technology, art, and politics. However, by the end of the 20th century, it had become clear that design's main imperative was to create and reflect meaning in the context of everyday life. Back in the early 1980s, that had not been quite so evident. In my earlier book, I failed to provide any useful working definitions or defining frameworks for the two main concepts, design and culture, that I was at pains to document. This is still a daunting task as they are both difficult, complex concepts, which have transformed themselves significantly over time and which have been defined by different people at different times in different ways. However, there are some useful defining characteristics which are worth mentioning, if only tentatively. In linguistic terms, for example, the word design, with its obvious, although misleading roots in the Italian diseig and French
it's really
design,
loud downstairs.
can be used both verbally to design and substantively design, the latter deriving as a direct result of the former. This allows one the freedom to treat it ambiguously both as a process and as a result of that process. From the perspective of this study, therefore, it was deemed important to discuss both designing and design, and their interface with culture. This double level of meaning imbues the concept with an appropriate richness. The word culture is even harder to define, denoting, as it can, so many different things from its normative meaning when it is used to describe highly valued, highly aestheticized activities, such as opera, poetry, theatre, and fine art, which are believed by many people to represent the greatest of human achievements, to its anthropological sense, in which it refers more simply to a way of life. Interestingly, like design, culture has also a verbal derivation, linked to the idea of growing or nurturing. In recent times, the word has been transformed into a noun and denoting the result of the above activity. Putting the two words, design and culture, together immediately compounds their complexities, and they impact upon each other in interesting ways. Design's relationship with culture is, for example, significant at both of the latter's levels. Whether high or popular, indeed, this dualism constitutes an important leitmotif in this text. The tension between the high-minded idealism underpinning modernist design ideas and the value-free approach of the postmodernists, who embrace the importance of culture difference, can be seen as one of the dominant themes of the period, and the one which stimulated the strongest design debates. In its visual and material incarnations, design embodied that tension. The structure of this book reflects the multiple context of design as it evolved through the 20th century, and the text emphasizes the way in which it had been both an agent and a mirror of change. While many other accounts of design and material culture see them performing a primarily illustrative role, this study credits design with having a formative function within society and culture, believing that through its visual material language and the ideological values and messages it carries within it, it can communicate complex messages. In turn, these can be negotiated and transformed but they are difficult to ignore. In this sense, design is seen as being part of the dynamic process through which culture is actually constructed, not merely reflected. If the culture of consumption makes design necessary, technological progress makes it possible. Engendered as a process by the division of labour which played a part in the development of a model of industrial production, design carries technology's messages with it into the socio-cultural context. It both mediates the philosophical underpinnings of industrial manufacturing, its essential rationality, for example, and the cultural messages of the materials of manufacture, transferring them into the arena of consumption. The second chapters in the two main parts of this book address design's relationship with the culture of technology. In determining production technologies and specifying materials, the designer plays a key part within the production process of goods and images. In essence, design acts as a bridge between the worlds of production and consumption, as the process of designing is transformed into the social-cultural concept, design. Materials of special significance in this context. Until they have been designed and have become material somethings, they have minimal cultural content. The designer holds enormous power in this respect and can manipulate materials to create multiple meanings, in spite of the fact that they will inevitably subsequently be transformed within the context of consumption and use. The third chapters in each section of the book turn from the worlds of consumption and production to that of the designer, whose primary function is to act as a bridge between the two distinct spheres. It is not the intention here to suggest that he or she, mostly he, is a monolithic, heroic figure, but rather to demonstrate the fact that design is a practice as well as an abstract concept, and that the cultural contents of that practice is part of the bigger picture. Design practice has always been fragmented and diverse, and with enormous chasms separating its specialist fields. The fashion designer and the car designer, for example, have always inhabited different universes. It is also a moving target, constantly transforming itself to suit the economic, technological, political and cultural climate within which it's function at any time. Due to the fact that 20th century professional design practice emanated from two main roots, however, there have always been areas of commonality across some specialized design fields. While one phase of modern design originated within a commercial tradition, manifesting itself either in two-dimensional graphic advertising or in various kinds of display or spectacle within overtly set out to promote consumption in various ways, its other important phase emerged as an extension of the work of architects, who believed they could control the whole visual and material environment and make the world a better place to live in. These chapters document the evolving, complex and overlapping routes taken by these two traditions and the design practices they engendered. They also track the emergence and development of designer culture, one of design's most potent contributions to 20th century cultural life, which is predicted on the need at one level of the market for design to maintain a link with fine art in order to imbue it with a high level of cultural significance and to distinguish certain products from other, more mundane goods in the marketplace. Most significantly, perhaps, the strategic cultural referencing also enabled goods with an overt design content frequently made manifest by a marketing or branding link with a designer's name, to command higher prices than anonymous products. The fourth chapters in each section of the text focus on the ideas and discourses that have underpinned design practice since 1900, as a set of ideas which emerged in the years between 1900 and 1939, and forms an ideological baseline for design practice, as an aesthetic ideal which influenced a new generation of designers, as well as the many nations which sought to distinguish themselves as modern after the Second World War. Modernism dominates that picture, even though the period of its demise, which began in the 1960s, is almost as long as the one in which it was hegemonic. In the final analysis, modernism's impact was felt most accurately by those cultural institutions, museums and educational establishments among them, which embrace its ideology most fully. However, the concept of modernity, or rather the multiple modernities, experienced by the mass of consumers, had an enormous effect on everyday life, as it was lived by vast numbers of people during the 20th century. Designed goods and images played a key role in providing them with access to those modernities. The last chapters in both sections of the book take as their subjects the ways in which, once its key contexts and discourses were established, design has been used by powerful political and economic groupings, nations and corporations in particular, both to define and express their identities and to empower themselves. In this context, design's ability to embody and express the idea of international modernity was especially meaningful, although local inflections were inevitably developed to reflect the special features of the nations and corporations which use design as an intrinsic feature of their modernizing strategies. These chapters demonstrate the power of design both to form and to express identities, whether for political or commercial ends. They also touch on its capacity to construct and represent the stereotypical characteristics of a range of culturally defined categories, such as class, gender, and ethnicity, offered up by individuals for negotiation in the marketplace. These 10 chapters offer a picture of design as it relates to culture from a number of key perspectives, and describe different facets of that complex relationship. As we have seen, design and culture are both complex phenomena. If there is one concept which lies at the heart of the relationship in the 20th century and which holds the study together, however, it is that of identity and identities. The way in which individuals and groups depend upon the mass media as a means of defining themselves in groups is a key characteristic of modern life. Increasingly through the 20th century, values were communicated to people less and less through interaction with their local communities and more through the media. Through its inherent relationship with industrial production, a key agent of the mass mediation, and its presence in the mass disseminated goods, images and services that resulted from that process, design became a key component of all the messages that were communicated. To extend Marshall McLuhan's analysis of the mass media, not only is the medium the message, it is the design of the medium which is crucial in the context, as it determines the way in which the message is read and negotiated. Arguably, by the late 20th century, design had become more significant than the medium itself, as it played an increasingly ubiquitous role in influencing the ways in which individuals and groups define themselves. In other words, the lifestyle references in the media became the most significant communicators of their message. Design expresses itself visually and materially, primarily, although not exclusively, in the context of consumption, and it's negotiated through the agency of taste, which underpins consumer choice. It's a complex language, however, which can operate simultaneously as representation and as materiality. This way of thinking about design prioritizes its role within the identity formation. In the words of the cultural critic Grant McCracken, without consumer goods, certain acts of self-definition and collective definition in this culture would be impossible. Those definitions are, inevitably, as numerous as the individuals and the groups that relate to them. At the same time, however, a number of key overreaching identities emerge in the 20th century. Notable among them we call modern. The visual style developed by the modernists, simple, undecorated, etc., was one way of recognizing the modern, but the definition of modernity went beyond that to include the experience of engaging in a lifestyle which embraced all that modern life had to offer. From technologically sophisticated goods to access for women to the public sphere. Inevitably, that experience varied according to the situations of individuals or groups, dependent upon the vagaries of class, gender and race. Design became everyone's bridge to their own brand of modernity. In the first half of the 20th century, the term design can be understood as being synonymous with modern design, although its characteristics varied according to whose modernity was in question, and in certain instances, modern could even be expressed by the adoption of a historical style. The latter half of the century presents a more complex picture, one which, in this book, is characterized by the umbrella term postmodernism, used as a catch-all to describe the pluralistic cultures that emerged in those years. Within postmodernity, arguably, design had an even more integrated role, its very existence being one of the prerequisites of the condition. However, even the postmodernity, on one level, the concepts of design and modernity continued to be linked, and it remained very hard to disengage them from each other. This text is dependent upon a number of theoretical texts and situates itself within the body of literature relating to the subject of the culture of consumption, which emerged in the 1980s and 90s. Feminist ideas developed in the same decade have also been a strong influence. It is especially indebted to two texts published in 1986. The first of these is the Andreas Hussein's After the Great Divide, Modernism, Mass Culture and Postmodernism. The ideas articulated in that book can be seen to relate directly to design, even though Hussein stopped short of pushing very hard in that direction himself, as it was not the focus of his study. The second text, Pierre Bourdieu's Distinction, a social critique of the judgment of taste, written first in the 1970s but translated into English in the mid-1980s, also provided an important framework for the study of design and culture. This text positioned design within a socio-cultural framework which made sense of it, and which took Thorstein Veblen's innovative ideas of the late 19th century forward several stages. Although much of the material in Bourdieu's book is dated now, and the case studies were very specifically French, This proposition and the exercising of taste underpins both the shape and the dynamic of modern society, and culture is one which has still not been fully acknowledged. So preoccupied have historians and theorists been until recently with the post-Marxist ideas, and with prioritising production over consumption. Bourdieu's ideas help challenge the modernist framework, which has tended to dominate most accounts of design to date. In trying to encompass a wider spectrum of design, activities and objects, this text is more ambitious than its 1986 predecessor. The primary focus on product design remains, but more effort has been made to include fashion, graphic, interior, environmental and virtual design where appropriate. This is not simply for inclusiveness for its own sake, but rather because the author has come to understand that modes of professional practice and ideas flowed from one area to another through the 20th century, and that consumers and users do not compartmentalize design goods and images in the same way as manufacturing industry. Over a period of time, ideas generated within specialized design fields went on to influence others. The role played by identity within fashion design, for example, permeated the world of interior decoration in the early century and the subsequently went on to play a role within car design in the 1990s. Similarly, the emphasis on spectacle, visible in the earlier 20th century shop window display, moved into objects themselves through the agency of industrial designers in the 1930s. Also, the aesthetic relationship that consumers have long had with the decorative art objects, ceramics, glass and textiles among them, has finally been transferred to computer-generated images. These are just some of the insights, and it has been possible to gain by considering design across a range of media and within a historical context. Most importantly, however, this text sets out to avoid the historicizing tendencies of its predecessor. In spite of efforts to withstand their often strident claims, the dominance of modernist texts in the early 1980s was such that the 1986 study was inevitably influenced by them and unwittingly reproduced their rhetoric and their tendency to reductivism to some extent. All that has changed since the maturation of the disciplines of cultural and media studies and the impact of postmodern ideas in the broader sense. It is now much easier to understand that design had and continues to have no fixed definition or meanings, nor one ideal path to follow. Rather, it is a constantly transforming concept, reflected in a set of practices and influenced by a broad context of changing ideologies and discourses, which have affected its shifting parameters. If a discourse of design can be developed, it must be one which recognises a high level of relativism, pragmatism and contextualization that has determined the concept's past and which will undoubtedly continue to affect its future. Design will continue to be influenced by consumption, the fashion system, identities of all kinds and production, whether industrial or craft-based, as well as by broader ideologies and discourses outside its control. It's a constantly moving target, although its future is, like everything else, significantly influenced by its past. In short, the picture of design and designers is constantly being repainted. This book can only, therefore, present a sketch of it, as the colours will constantly change.